Hello, everybody. Welcome to the National Standard Practice Manual 2026 edition webinar. We will provide you with an overview and update. My name is Kirsten Brookles. I'm a Senior Managing Director at NASEO. Julie, next slide, please. You are joining a webinar and the webinar logistics. All participants are muted. If you have a question to the webinar, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You may need to hover or click on your screen in order for that option to appear. We are also recording this webinar and will post the webinar recording on NASEO's website and the YouTube channel. Next slide, please. In case you're not familiar with NASEO, we are the National Association of State Energy Officials. We are the only national nonprofit association for the governor-designated energy officials from each of the 56 states and territories. And we serve as a resource for and about our members through topical committees, regional dialogues, and informational events that facilitate peer learning, best practice sharing, and consensus building. We also advance the interest of the state and territory energy offices before Congress and the administration. If you'd like to learn more, you can visit our website at www.naseo.org. NASEO is governed by a board of directors comprised of our members and regional representatives from all 6 regions. Next slide, please. We have 6 topical committees that meet on a occasional basis. We have committees on affordability, buildings, electricity, financing, security, and transportation. And NASEO also has a number of priorities that cover cross-cutting issues such as planning, innovation, workforce, sustainability, policy, and resilience. Next slide, please. I will now turn it over to Julie Michaels, who is the Senior Fellow at NASEO, to walk us through the agenda.
Thank you, Kirsten, and welcome everyone. Here is a snapshot of what we're going to be covering today, providing a bit of information about the National Energy Screening Project and some background on the National Standard Practice Manual, which you'll be hearing us refer to as the NSPM. We'll touch on its use and application to date, and then what we're really going to spend time on is highlighting some of the key guidance and updates provided in the new 2026 edition that just came out last month. And then we will close up reviewing some supporting resources and tools that are available to states and practitioners in this field. So by way of background, and in case you aren't familiar with the range of products and services provided by NASEO's NESP effort. So there's a number of things here. The NSPM, located right at the top, is what I would refer to as sort of the mothership of the various resources that are developed through the NESP. And then there are supporting resources, including a methods, tools, and resources handbook for quantifying BCA impacts. Coming soon is a open BCA open source tool, a modeling tool for conducting benefit cost analyses. And also over the years, I, along with others, have been supporting and providing some state technical assistance and facilitation services around applying the NSPM guidance. We also have, and will soon be sort of relaunching, some training and certification around benefit cost analysis. And then there's been some other sort of related research and guidance developed around conducting distributional equity analysis, and then research also just generally looking at developing case studies for specific use cases. And you have a copy of, you should have access to a copy of this. You can visit the website where you can find more information. So importantly, just a quick background about the NSPM evolution and the various supporting resources. So as some of you may well know, this project, the National Energy Screening Project, was fortunate to find a new home within NASEO earlier this year. at the start of 2026. But prior to that, many of all of this various resources were launched and developed through a nonprofit organization called E for the Future. And it started with a 2017 NSPM version that focused on efficiency, trying to address improvements to cost effectiveness analysis of resources. Based on feedback from states and in which that were using the efficiency version, there was an ask to develop a broader version that addressed a full range of distributed energy resources. So that was published in 2020. And as you'll learn today, much of the NSPM focuses on what to include in a benefit cost test and why. And there was an ask to develop a resource on, well, how do you actually quantify impacts? What methodologies do you use? And that was a 2022 resource that I just mentioned on the last slide, the MTR handbook. And now, with all this experience, especially since 2020, we have updated the NSPM to better reflect current needs, to learn to capture what we've learned over the last several years in providing technical assistance to states. And through all this, again, we've worked in those states back since 2018. You'll hear about those a bit in a minute. And we started providing the training and certification around the NSPM. So the National Standard Practice Manual, as I said, it expands upon this new version, 2026, expands on the 2020 edition. And it builds, and there is reference to the traditional cost test that you find in the California Standard Practice Manual, and the NSPM does a very clear job and dedicates an appendix to the difference between the different types of tests and how the NSPM builds on that California manual. And then I've mentioned these other documents, and please do go check out our website where you can find more information. So there's a range of users intended for the NSPM, and they're presented here. And I'm sure many of you on this webinar fall within one of these categories. Importantly, the NSPM really focuses on DER programs, largely utility DER programs. The principles and concepts apply broadly to other regulatory contexts, and you'll hear Tim Wolf speak to that more specifically. And beyond just these regulatory contexts, it's primarily focused on electric applications, electric utility applications, but also natural gas and more broadly. Here is a snapshot just showing you across the country, there's about 16 states where the NSPM has been formally applied in one form or another. In some case, this has been a single DER type in a PUC docket, for example. In other cases, it's been across multiple DERs and looking to develop a consistent unified benefit cost test that applies to different DER applications. And as you can see in the blue, we have many states or jurisdictions where the NSPM has been recommended and or extensively cited. What's not shown here is we actually also have a few Canadian provinces that have used the NSPM formally through their respective processes. So what is benefit cost analysis? Many of you may be familiar with what a BCA involves. Essentially, you are comparing a reference case of business as usual or without a DER investment compared to looking at a scenario where you are going to analyze an investment in a distributed energy resource or some combination of resources. And you're essentially looking at the value stream over a certain period of time and taking the net present value, applying, an inflation rate, and then also a discount rate to come up with determining whether there is a net benefit or a net cost to that investment as compared to an alternative. And of course, the question is, well, what are the benefits and what are the costs that you are going to account for in this analysis? And that's where the NSPM really comes in, is to help identify what those are, and then all the different considerations that come into play in conducting a BCA. So we're sharing with you here just a quick snapshot of what you will find in the updated 2026 edition of the NSPM. Some of you may be familiar with the last version, and this should look fairly familiar. There's multiple parts to the NSPM. The first part really a high level look at what does a decision framework involve. What are some key principles that can guide benefit cost analysis? Those have been instrumental in the work that we do. How do you develop a test and a multi-step process for doing that? And then again, understanding, valuing resources in different contexts. And that is a new dedicated chapter in this version. Many of the other chapters are the same. They've been improved, and we're going to walk you through what all of these largely are. And then, of course, there's a range of appendices included in the NSPM, and some of them are very new, are new or expand upon earlier guidance. So I'm going to just very quickly walk through these areas where there's key updates and guidance, but I'm not going to get in any detail because that's where we're going to share some specific slides. So as I said, we've broadened the framework, we've updated some of the principles, but we're going to review those with you so you have a sense of the full scale of them. And again, looking at what does consistent DER evaluation mean in the context of programs, procurement, pricing, infrastructure investments, state policy and planning context. So there's a broad range to consider there. There is, based on experience, an expansion of a multi-step process for developing a primary test and addressing a host of key BCA parameters. And then there's a deeper dive in the DER specific chapters that look at applicability and materiality of impacts and accounting for interactive effects across those DER types. Grid and demand flexibility, in particular, DERs play a role with demand flexibility. That's a much front and center issue that many of you are thinking about. So there's a deeper dive on that topic. And then, of course, a host of other issues, accounting for reliability and resilience, uncertainty and risk. And then this ninth area, which, by the way, these don't correlate with the chapters in the NSPM, but the ninth area takes a deep dive looking at specific DER scenarios and what are some key BCA considerations. Selecting a discount rate. We touch on quantifying DER impacts and referencing the MTR handbook for more detail, but letting the reader get an idea of what's involved. And then, as I mentioned, there are appendices. So I'm going to speak lightly on the first few slides here, and then I'm going to hand it over to Tim. But in the 2020 version of the NSPM, we really focused on this phase one, which is developing the test, developing a primary test, deciding whether a jurisdiction is going to have a secondary test, if any, and what those tests involve. And then importantly, determining if complementary analyses are needed. And these might be analyses that are important to address, to align with your jurisdictional policies, but that they don't necessarily belong as a BCA test. Second phase is to identify those methodologies. How are you going to quantify this? And then the third phase is to actually conduct the analyses and interpret the results. And importantly, below these three phases, if you will, is that ensuring consistency in the valuation across different contexts. And that's including the benefits and costs consistent methodology. So you aren't using certain assumptions in one area, in one context differently from another. And then, of course, the value streams. And the principles, which we'll review next here, cut across all of these phases. So these are fairly constant principles compared to the 2020 version. What we've really updated is this principle number 7, which focuses on separating BCAs from other impacts, such as rate and bill impact analysis, which is, of course, very important to addressing affordability of any type of a resource investment. But we'll hear about that a bit in a minute from Tim. But in the meantime, these principles, I will emphasize here to you, have really been foundational in work that states have taken on when they convene a stakeholder group or a work group, and they look to updating a test or creating a new test. They turn to these principles to help guide the discussions, the development of tests, and some of the key considerations. So they truly are foundational. They are policy neutral, and they serve to help inform the development of BCAs. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tim Wolf with Synapse Energy and Economics, and he's going to walk us through some of the areas that I've touched on thus far. Tim, go ahead.
Thanks, Julie, and thanks everybody for joining. So I'm going to start here on a new chapter, a new concept that was not really included in the NSPM in 2020, which focused entirely on distributed energy resources. What we say in the new NSPM is that these concepts, these principles, really apply in many different contexts, whether they're regulatory or whether they're state energy agencies. If a utility or other stakeholders are looking into costs and benefits, whether it's for distribution, transmission, generation, it makes a lot of sense for lots of reasons to use consistent principles and concepts. So in the next slide, I'll just say a little bit more about that, where we list all these different contexts. The top row here is the DER programs we talked about in the first NSPM. But in addition to that, if there's a benefit cost analysis for utility scale generation, and you need to look at costs and benefits, same issues come up. Resource procurements, where utilities are running proposals, RFPs for purchase power agreements, and it's important to understand costs and benefits. Energy price signals often are set based upon marginal benefits, and so you need to have a good sense of those. Grid modernization, maybe many of you have seen grid modernization benefit cost analyses. All the concepts and principles should be the same. We use the term dynamic system planning in the manual to refer to things like integrated resource planning, integrated distribution planning, where there's a dynamic analysis to optimize a whole bunch of resources at once. Again, same concepts. Retrospective prudence reviews, performance incentive mechanisms, and then state energy policies, plannings, programs. And the advantages here are pretty clear, pretty important, that using consistent assumptions, methodologies, same principles, means that your decision making is going to be economically sound across the different regulatory contexts. You'll be able to account for your applicable policies consistently across all these contexts. And if you have good stakeholder input in one context, then that can carry through to the others if you're applying, again, the same kind of principles. And of course, there's administrative efficiency of having consistent costs and benefits applied, as warranted. And I will say, in some of these contexts, there might be good reason to have something slightly different, but that should be done if there's a reason for it and not just because people aren't paying attention. Next slide. So Julie mentioned briefly this concept of complementary analyses. And what these mean are analyses where, for one reason or another, it doesn't make sense to put in certain costs, benefits, or impacts into a BCA. And one of the most important ones is rate and bill impact analyses. We've said this many times in other NSPM versions. We point out, the manual points out that rate, bills, analyses look at different impacts, and they look at them in different ways than in a benefit cost analysis. They attempt to answer different questions. So for a benefit cost analysis, the question is, will total cost to all customers increase or decrease as a result of the investment? Rates and bill impact analyses look at the question of, will rates go up or down? as a result of the investments. And there are different questions requiring different metrics and different analyses, separate analyses. That becomes clear if you look at the bottom row here for the example metrics in each case. So for the benefit cost analysis, we tend to look at things like the present value of changes in cost, changes in benefits, net benefits, benefit cost ratios. Whereas for rate and bill impact analysis, we look at what are the rate impacts in terms of cents per kilowatt hour, in terms of percent change? What are the bill impacts in terms of dollars per month? What are the participation rates? Because that affects how your bills change. And because the metrics are so different, it's really important to keep the analyses separate. And in the next slide, I can show you one of the key things that needs to be done in the rate and bill impact analysis is comparing the two results, but in a way that is useful and meaningful. So in the top part of this chart, you can see the benefit cost analysis results. This is a hypothetical energy efficiency portfolio. The numbers aren't tied to any one particular program, but you probably recognize kind of how these numbers play out because I've seen it in many different contexts where you start out when the benefit cost analysis looks great, but then you do your rate impact analyses, and there might be a rate impact that is of concern to some parties, and so you need to think about, well, what does that mean? And one of the things to think about is what are the bill impacts? In some cases, for the non-participants, they might be close to the rate impacts or maybe the same. For the participants, the rate impacts might be actually positive. Bills might go down. And then you want to look at participation rates as well. So the whole idea here is that this analysis should be conducted as a whole, looking at all these important factors, and then comparing those to the benefits. And one last thing I meant to say a minute ago is that oftentimes the rate impact measure test is used to look at rate impacts. And we discovered that because the rate impact measure test doesn't tell you this kind of information that you can see here that you can get from a rate and bill impact analysis. And so rate impact measure test might be okay to use as like a threshold test to see whether to take the extra step and do the analysis to do rate and bill impact analyses, but on its own, it's not a good way to sort of understand affordability and really what true rate impacts are going to be. So the original NSPM had a fairly straightforward, simple, multi-step process. In the 2026 version, we've expanded it, made it a bit more clear. And as Julie mentioned, developing the primary test is really the core of the NSPM. It was the original reason why we came up with an NSPM. And I'll just quickly mention these steps because they're all important, and each one will help with the whole stakeholder process to make sure that the test is done in a way that's sort of comprehensive and transparent. First step is to look at your energy policy goals. That's kind of essential to understanding what you really need to end up with. Review and account for the relevant and material utility system impacts. Those are the impacts that affect revenue requirements and affect the utility costs and benefits. Decide which non-utility system impacts to include. These include things like host customer impacts or societal impacts. Develop any secondary tests. The manuals briefly describe secondary tests as those that can be used to provide additional information and tell you more about the programs, but not necessarily be the one that's used to make a decision about going forward or not. It's like additional information. Then, and the next step is getting a good discount rate. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Establishing an assessment level to inform decisions. And that means for energy efficiency, for example, you might look at the program level, you might look at the sector level, you might look at the whole portfolio. That's kind of important to get that early on. Considering whether to do complementary analyses or not. And this again might depend upon your policy goals. And then documenting and making sure that the whole process is transparent and that everybody understands what's in the test and what's not in the test and why. So this is a critical concept that was included in the first two NSPMs, and it's in the second one, I'm sorry, in the 2026 NSPM, and it's so important it's worth taking a minute to cover it, which is prior to this work, there were these traditional perspectives that came from the California Standard Practice Manual that were used really throughout the country in coming up with benefit cost tests. And this graphic on the left shows you what they are. They all start with the utility system impacts. That's kind of fundamental to looking at the impacts of the DERs. And then beyond that, there's the total resource perspective, which includes host customer and other fuel impacts. And that leads to the total resource cost test that you're probably all familiar with. And then outside of that, there are societal impacts that one would consider from a societal perspective and use in the societal cost test. And a fundamental concept introduced in the NSPM is this notion of a regulatory perspective, which is a little different from those, where it accounts for the utility system impacts, because those are fundamental, but it makes decisions on other impacts depending upon the policy goals of the specific jurisdiction you're in. You might choose to include host customer impacts, or you might not. You might choose to include some societal impacts, but not all of them, or you might not. And this is a critical perspective that helps inform what we're referring to as the jurisdiction-specific test, a test that might end up being unique, specific to any one jurisdiction based upon their policy goals. In the next slide, I can tell you how this kind of comes together. You want to look to, there you go, thank you. So this shows the traditional tests from the California Standard Practice Manual. At the bottom there, there's the 5 tests, and then how the jurisdiction-specific test compares to them. You're probably familiar with the utility cost test representing the utility system perspective, and the total resource cost test represents utility plus customers, the participating customers. The silent cost test looks at society as a whole, but the participant cost test is useful for program design and so forth, but not so much for program screening. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the rate impact test, it purports to address impacts on rates, but as I mentioned earlier, it's a very narrow view of that and really doesn't give you all the information that you might need. And so the jurisdiction-specific test represents the perspective of regulators and other decision makers. It might be energy offices, it might be municipal boards of directors, or whomever is making the decisions on what are the appropriate tests to use. So the manual has several tables like this to give users a sense of how to address some of these impacts. And as you can see, there are a lot of impacts for a lot of different types of DERs, and we try to summarize it briefly here. Please note that this table is illustrative, and it shouldn't be taken too far. Really, each user should give some thought to these questions. But what the purpose here is to indicate that for some DERs, there are some impacts that are cost in green, cost in red, a benefit in green, or it might depend on the use case in orange. And then in some cases, there might be not material or not relevant, in which case it's useful to just note that down so you know that. And you can see right away, for example, here, the column on the right is for electrification programs. In this case, they're mostly cost, or it depends, because this is the electric utility system impacts, by the way. And so for electrification programs, since they increase electricity consumption, you tend to see costs on the electric system, whereas for the other DERs, you might see benefits on the electric system. And again, this is just a way to kind of keep track of what kind of impacts you might or might not want to include in your tests and how to do it. And the one last thing I'll say on this, which is kind of important, is that the manual is pretty clear about how consistent tests should be applied across the DERs. Otherwise, you're going to get inefficient decision making. And so for energy efficiency, for example, ancillary services might not be material, as indicated here, whereas for distributed storage, ancillary services might be material, depending upon the use case. And just because the ancillary services value is 0 in the energy efficiency use, but it's a positive or a negative number in the distributed storage, doesn't mean you have a different test. It just means that, in one test or one application of the test, some of the inputs might be not material or not relevant, but it's still a consistent test. We have a couple more of these. So this is a natural gas utility system where the impacts are slightly different if you look over the rows there. In this case, the electrification DER programs, you see benefits because they result in reduced gas consumption. And in this case, there's not, to our knowledge, a lot of gas distributed generation programs or distributed storage programs. So in that case, we indicate those are not relevant. And then there's one more of these on the next slide where there's also categories of impacts that we refer to as other fuels, might be oil, propane, wood, gasoline, and whether their cost or benefits might depend upon, what the application is, as you can see here. Host customers is an important piece of the entire picture, whether you want to include those or not. And if you do, it's important to understand which impacts are cost versus benefits. And then for societal, the NSPM, lumps these in or categorizes these into these 4 groups and indicate here what might be positive benefits, which might depend upon the use case. Demand flexibility, as Julie mentioned, is an important impact, and it can come up in different ways by DER programs. They might be able to help shed load. They might be able to help shift load. They might be able to help modulate load. And as you probably all know, this is becoming increasingly important. And so it's important to think through how these impacts might be accounted for in a benefit cost analysis. And the manual explains that really these kind of benefits tend to affect the magnitude of the utility system impacts, whether it's the generation or maybe it's the distribution system impacts, and more so than it might affect, say, host customer or societal impacts. And a lot of times these benefits can be or are best accounted for in the estimate of those utility system impacts. So maybe they're embedded in the distribution benefits or they're embedded in the generation benefits. And it's important to kind of understand that to make sure you're either not double counting it or you're not missing it. And demand flexibility can be important, can have both long-term and short-term impacts. So, and they can even create this concept of optionality, where by providing flexibility, planners, utilities, and others have greater options over time due to the additional flexibility of the resources.
Tim, before you go on, can we go to slide 25? There was one question on the ELEC or ALEC column. Do you put transmission and distribution capacity as either a benefit or cost for DER type because it depends on timing and coincidence with transmission or distribution system peak for the added electricity load?
I'm sorry, I could only hear part of that. Which column, and can you repeat the question?
Sure, sorry. The ALEC or the last column, electrification column,
Yeah.
do you put transmission and distribution capacity as either a benefit or cost for DER type because it depends on timing and coincidence with transmission or distribution system peak for the added electricity load?
Yes. Is there a question?
Yes, that was the question, if that is the correct understanding.
Yes, that's what the orange indicates. It depends upon what's happening in the use case.
Great, thank you.
So reliability and resilience. As you all know, this is becoming increasingly important. The new manual has a section on this, mostly to help categorize and define it and talk about how to account for these 2 important impacts. And you probably have all seen there's a variety of different definitions for these 2 concepts. But in sum, what the 2026 manual says is that reliability focuses on preventing or avoiding more routine kind of outages that are due to fluctuating load and generation and so forth. Whereas resilience is more defined as the ability to prepare for threats, adapt to changing conditions, withstand and recover from disruptions. And typically, they're disruptions that are atypical or black sky conditions, unpredictable weather, and so forth. And that resilience focuses on how to better enable restoration of power, whereas reliability is trying to avoid the loss of power in the first place. And in the context of a benefit cost analysis, reliability impacts really apply only to the utility system impacts. That is, the ability to or the need to build up the system to keep the lights on as needed. DERs can provide some benefits to help with that. Whereas resilience, really, when you think it through, the benefits largely flow to the host customers because it allows those host customers to get power back on sooner or to prevent the power going off in the first place, depending upon your DER. And so that becomes important in doing your BCAs because, as you can see in the table here, for reliability, really the benefits apply mostly to the utility system or the gas system, whereas for resilience, the benefits apply mostly to host customers, in some cases to society. So it's what the chapter now describes is how to think this through. Maybe in some situations there's slight differences in what you see here, but generally how to categorize them and which category to put them in, and to make sure you're not double counting or undercounting them. The 2026 manual also includes a new discussion on uncertainty and risk, and it takes, some very standard definitions of uncertainty and risks from the literature, where talking about uncertainty is really the situation where a correct or an exact value of a particular input is either unknown or cannot be known. And as you probably know, that comes up in a lot of inputs into a BCA. Risk, on the other hand, is different. It's defined as the adverse outcome that can result from uncertainty. And so when you think of it, risk is the expected value of potential loss due to that outcome. And there's a simple relationship that helps think this through, which is risk is equal to the probability of the adverse outcome times the consequence of that outcome. And there are many methods for accounting for risk in BCAs. The NSPM talks about these here that are the most commonly used and probably easier to use. This particular topic gets very complicated very fast, but these are the ones that can be used relatively easily. You're familiar with some of the sensitivity analyses, scenario analyses, expected value analyses, a direct estimate what you think the probability is, what you think the consequence is, and you've got an estimate. A hedge value, where you can sometimes use market instruments to indicate what a risk is for buying or purchasing or particular impact, or in particular, this comes up in fuel costs quite a bit. And if there's not sufficient time or resources to do an in-depth analysis, it's possible to do a simplified adder, like a proxy value that approximates how much risk might be associated with DERs. And you should be thinking about both increases to risk and reductions in risk. And also, we won't go into details on this, but risk-adjusted discount rates can be used to account for risk when you're doing the discounting of your costing and benefits. This is another new chapter where the NSPN talks about specific scenarios that include multiple DER products, projects, programs combined to make a slightly different kind of a program or a resource. And these might include multiple DERs on site at a particular building or facility. It might include non-infrastructure DER solutions like non-wire solutions or non-pipe solutions. It might include virtual power plants or microgrids. In all these cases, you've got multiple types of DERs. And really the same concepts and principles apply to these that apply to the DERs in isolation. But there are considerations that become even more important in this context where you've got multiple DERs. And that might include interactive load impacts between the DERs, active interactions, in the use case and balancing competing priorities in DERs. Like, for example, if you've got storage here and you've got efficiency there, how do they sort of work together? Unlocking novel value streams because you've got multiple DERs, accounting for uncertainty when avoiding grid investments or performing as grid assets. Assessing the value of flexibility can be very different when you've got multiple DERs. Time-dependent value can change quite a bit. Location-dependent value can change quite a bit. Supporting system costs, and then accounting for existing DER impacts and how they affect the different scenarios listed here. So a lot of considerations, and a lot of it is really a matter of being more thoughtful and going into more detail on some of these, in addition to what you would do if they were in isolation. Next slide. Discount rates. So the manual does provide a little bit more details on discount rates than in the past. You probably know this, but real briefly, discount rates have a large impact on BCA results, especially over the long term. And with DERs, often there's a long-term stream of benefits, and you want to make sure they're fully accounted for. In this graph, we just show that if you had a stream of benefits, for example, of $10 per year for 20 years, it would be that blue line at the top. And if you discounted at different rates, this shows you what dollar value you end up with in present value terms. And as you can see, the discount rates matter quite a bit. So in the 2026 manual, we provide a bit more guidance on discount rates. The next slide, we summarize it. It's a complex topic. We try to boil down into one slide and a graph. But briefly, the manual explains that there's a couple of steps here for identifying the proper discount rate, including establishing that the jurisdiction-specific test discount rate should align with a regulatory perspective and the time preference that goes along with the regulatory perspective, because really the discount rate is meant to represent the time preference. Also, you should consider the time preference of current utility customers and consider how much weight to give to future customers versus current customers. Fourth, to consider how other policy goals might affect the regulatory time preference. And then consider whether BCA assumptions have adequately accounted for risk, because as I mentioned, you could account for risk in the discount rates. And then just quickly, the chart on the left shows that there's these different perspectives: utility shareholders, current customers, future customers, the regulatory perspective, and then societal. Some of those are probably familiar to you. The notion here, 2 points. One is if you use the utility cost of capital for your discount rate, well, that's reflecting the value of the utility investors, but the purpose of your benefit cost analysis is rarely to optimize shareholder value. The purpose is usually to serve customers and to optimize your resources to best serve customers, which suggests you should be using something reflecting customer preferences. And the regulatory bar there is just to show that there's really a wide range that could be used by your jurisdiction-specific test. Once you've accounted for these factors over on the right and considered your policy goals and future and current customers. Moving along, just a couple more slides. So the 2026 manual includes a new discussion of, or I should say an expanded discussion of how to calculate impacts. The 2020 NSPM talked about the importance, actually all the NSPMs, about making sure that your impacts included in your test include all relevant and material impacts, even those that are hard to quantify and monetize. Because just because it's hard to monetize doesn't mean you should ignore it because you're clearly missing something. And so there's these various approaches that can be used. using monetary values is by far the best and the most sort of comprehensive and thorough way to do the job. What the arrow at the bottom shows is the different steps that should be used in developing monetary impacts. If you want more details on that, that's what the Methods, Tools, and Resources report that Julie mentioned is all about. It's a large report that goes into gory details on all of these different steps and provides lots of guidance there. If you don't have that time or those resources to do that, you could take values from other jurisdictions as long as they're transferable. You could come up with proxy values. You could talk about quantitative metrics that may not be monetary, but still there's something quantitative there that helps you inform your decisions. You can use qualitative information even. Again, it's harder to put these into tests, but they can put them in your analysis on the side to sort of inform the analysis. And then you can also use alternative thresholds, benefit cost ratios that are higher or lower than one, if you like. So that might be the end, unless there's one more for me to cover. No, that covers my slides. I'll turn it over to Julie.
Thank you, Tim. So appreciate Tim taking us through a whirlwind tour of really a sample of the kinds of things you will find in the National Standard Practice Manual. And I encourage you to go look and dig into the resource and let us know if you have questions, including interest in its application. On the NASEO NESP website, there's a host of information around experience to date, where states have used the NSPM and applied the guidance. And there are some case studies written up that might be useful. Furthermore, I'm going to touch on just a couple of the tools and resources I've mentioned thus far, but I did want to give everybody a preview coming this summer. I'm not going to put an exact date up there, but we're working hard to get this open source modeling tool I mentioned earlier. This was developed with funding from the Department of Energy, ND for the Future, and NASEO, and developed by ICF and Recurve. And we were fortunate to work very closely with the state of Michigan through a commission-led BCA collaborative. Michigan had gone through a process to develop a Michigan test that applies to all DERs and distribution system planning. And they had interest in developing some kind of an open source tool. And the timing with this project was such that we worked closely with that collaborative. We were fortunate to have DTE and Consumers Energy serve as the beta testers for the tool. And we are just getting prepared to launch it, really, hopefully next month. So giving you just a very quick preview of one example of an output, if you will. And this is something that will be, again, open source, publicly available, and free for jurisdictions. It allows a state to, a user to define its jurisdiction-specific test. It can also use traditional cost tests as a secondary test. It allows for analyzing resources on an 8760 basis and a more granular basis than many tools are capable of doing. It's not an Excel spreadsheet model. And importantly, once this is available, there is going to be, in addition to a comprehensive user guide and video tutorials, in coordination with LBNL, we will be providing some office hours as well as some limited state technical assistance. And we'll have more information on that on the Open BCA tool at NASEO once this is all up and going. So we're very excited about this companion, again, tool that can support the NSPM and help states with their benefit cost analysis efforts. And then lastly, I do want to just let everybody know that in the past years, the National Energy Screening Project provided some training and certification. We are now updating our curriculum because we have the new NSPM, and based on some feedback from past training evaluations, I'm working closely with my team at NASEO to update the resources and also identify the timing, and then especially for the NSPM certification in-person training, we're looking at different venues around the country to be providing this more in-depth course. And we'll have more information on this. We're looking to develop some kind of credits. It might be CEUs, it might be CPEs. This is all in the works, but we should have this up and going by this fall. And of course, the range of audiences is broad. In the past training that we've held, it has included, of course, state agency staff at PUCs, at state energy offices, consumer advocates, and moreover, utilities and evaluation practitioners and so forth. So stay tuned for that additional information coming your way. And in the meantime, I'm going to turn it back to Kirsten to see if there are any questions.
Great. Thank you, Julie and Tim. This was very exciting, and I'm very excited and looking forward to all the new tools and trainings coming this summer. We have a number of questions, so I'll try and get to most of them, but we also will put our information in the chat, or Julie will put her email. I'll put Julie's email in the chat, and then if there are any follow-up questions, there you have it. We'll put it in the chat too. We can get to any questions we can't get to right now. But there was a question on the discount rate. And from a regulatory perspective, when is it appropriate to use different discount rates for different DERs?
Yeah, I think it's rarely appropriate to use different discount rates for different DERs. I suppose if one is using a risk-adjusted discount rate, then you might decide that, well, this one DER has a very different risk profile than another, and in that case, you can justify different discount rates. Otherwise, I encourage against it, and I'm kind of speaking for myself now since this is a Q&A, just because it runs the risk of having different priorities across the two different DER types just because of the discount rate that was used. Actually, I can speak for the manual itself, where it says to as much as possible to use the same principles, concepts, including discount rates, assumptions, methodologies, all that.
I would just quickly add to that, Tim, that in the experience in some states that we've worked in, Maryland comes to mind, where sensitivities were done. And in Maryland, a Maryland unified BCA test was adopted to apply to all DERs. And there was a single discount rate adopted by the commission for a primary test. But for secondary tests, there were sensitivities that could be done using different discount rates. And that might be a way of just trying to understand how, but it's not a different discount rate for different DERs. It was just using a different discount rate more broadly.
Great, thank you. Another question, a lot of differences arise concerning the scope of DER BCA applicability in applying the cost effectiveness tests or tests. Can you address this? As for example, utilities continually maintain that as to core investments or investments that are mandatory, a least cost test should apply and not DER BCA. But regulators have indicated that even as to mandatory investments, there's usually engineering, design, etc. options, and the purpose of the DER BCA is to evaluate consistently what would be the most cost-effective option. Any reactions?
Yeah, I think I know what the question's getting at. There's another way to evaluate resources, and it's referred to as least cost best fit. And I think that's what's meant here by least cost in quotes. And that is a perfectly reasonable way to look at investments. It's been done for years and years for distribution investments that are deemed to be mandatory because you have to build it to meet demand. There's I think, a large debate in the industry about just where the line should be drawn between doing a full-blown benefit cost analysis, at least we've described here, versus a much more limited least cost best fit. In the least cost best fit, you don't look at benefits, you just look at costs and you get the lowest cost option. And I think again, there's a gray area between where the line should be drawn between the two. Now I'm speaking for myself. We don't say this much in the manual, but I think that benefit cost analysis should be sort of the default. And unless for some reason it's really clear that it's not necessary, or because in the absence of that, if you're just looking at the cost, you might not be doing a complete analysis. You might not indicate certain impacts. And you're making the assumption that the resource is necessary when in fact it might not be.
Great, thank you. There was a question on who has adopted NSPM in Canada. Which Canadian provinces or jurisdictions have adopted NSPM by their regulators or utilities or provincial governments? And I will also amend the question a little bit if you could perhaps elaborate on like other examples, how states have used this manual previously, and states that are interested in implementing it, what sort of potential next steps are for them.
Sure, I can speak to that. So quickly in Canada, I'm aware that New Brunswick has used the NSPM, and I believe Nova Scotia has well. And I know that the Independent System Operator Ontario some years ago provided used the NSPM as part of its review of investments, and in fact, the IESO there participated in some of our NSPM certified training that was held in Toronto a couple summers ago. And I know it's been recommended in British Columbia, but I don't believe it's been adopted there. As for in the states, so we've seen a number of states of the 16 in the map that I shared earlier. They cut across the country, and some have been for efficiency only, including New Hampshire and Arkansas and Minnesota are some states where it's been applied for efficiency. I believe New Jersey applied the NSPM principles as well. And importantly, Kirsten, you're raising a good point, because in some cases, the states go through, there is a formal docket that's opened. I mentioned Maryland, where there was a phase one. The direction was to, in this docket 9674, was to develop a unified BCA test that would cut across different DERs. But the state commission there had started by applying the NSPM for the utility electric vehicle plans first. Then it was applied to efficiency, and then they opened up this unified BCA docket. And they developed a test applying the NSPM in a formal work group process. And they're now actually completing a phase two process in which I've been involved with a consulting team to identify the methodologies for quantifying the impacts in that unified test. In the state of Michigan, there wasn't a formal work group process. The commission there directed the utilities to develop a new test using the NSPM, and the utilities hired their own consultants, went out, developed it, filed a report, and then there was a comment period where all the stakeholders could comment on that. And based on that, the commission issued an order adopting a test. So there's different ways this can be done in terms of how the NSPM application is used. I've even seen some states where commissions have just adopted the principles and it put them in an order without going through any type of formal application.
Great. I know there's a number of other questions that we haven't gotten to, but I put Julie's email in the chat. So if you have any further questions, please reach out to Julie or Josh. And thank you again so much, Julie and Tim, for discussing the manual, but not only for coming on today, but putting all this effort into adapting and updating the manual in 2026. I know this was a lot of work, and I really appreciate your efforts in updating the manual. So it's great to have you all at NASEO and have this now with NASEO. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.